There remains still the third side, the relation to absolute being of consciousness as action. This action is the setting aside of the particularity of the individual, or of the natural mode of its being for self, whence proceeds its certainty of being pure self-consciousness, of being in accordance with its action, that is, as an independent individual, one with absolute being. Since in action, purposiveness and end are distinguished, and pure insight in relation to this action equally adopts a negative attitude and, as in the other moments, denies its own self, it must, as regards purposiveness, exhibit itself as lacking in intelligence, since insight united with intention, that is, the harmony of end and means, appears to it as an other, or rather as the opposite of insight. As regards the end itself, however, it has to make badness, enjoyment, and possession its end, and so prove itself to be the impurest kind of intention, since pure intention, qua other, is equally impure intention. Paragraph 555 is short, but there's a lot going on here. Hegel's making an important transition from the second moment, which was one of the relations to absolute consciousness, that of knowledge, after talking about the first thing, which is faith's grasp on absolute being as such, how faith pictures absolute being to itself, then how faith knows absolute being. Now he's talking about action, the comportment of the believer to the object of faith, absolute being, whether that is understood in terms of the divine or in terms of, as we've seen already, the religious community. So he tells us there remains this third side, right? The relation to the absolute being of consciousness as action. And the word there is tun. We've seen this many times before. This came up a lot in the consciousness, right, in the reason section. I mean, it did come up to some degree in the consciousness and self-consciousness, but really in the reason section, where we had a lot of exploration of this once we got past the first part of reason. And then it came up again in the spirit section earlier on. We're constantly seeing this theme of it's not enough to talk just about thought, but thought itself must culminate in action. So what are the components of action? How does action articulate itself? Well, he tells us, action is the setting aside of the particularity of the individual in this case. So, this is talking about action by the person who really is a believer, not somebody who's just using belief to get, their own private ends, perhaps to get power or money or something like that, but somebody who is in a relationship of faith or belief, Glaube. They set aside their own, he says, particularity, or the natural mode of its being for self. The natural mode of its being for self, that we saw discussed in the entire culture section, right? This was what the ignoble consciousness focused on. So we're seeing the noble consciousness kind of rearing its head again. So he says, whence proceeds its certainty of being pure self-consciousness, of being in accordance with its action, that is, as an independent individual, one with absolute being. So right now, we've lost that sense of being one with absolute being by just, making oneself the absolute being. And the question is, well, how do we relate ourselves to this absolute being through what it is that we're doing, through our action? We might want to remind ourselves about the forms of action that Hegel has been talking about in this section and in previous sections, the religious comportment. What are religious actions? That's something we should think about. Not just in terms of, say, prayer, but in terms of service, devotion, sacrifice, right? And Hegel goes on to make a very important distinction here. He says, in action, two things that are very closely connected linguistically and intentionally are being distinguished from each other. namely the end and purposiveness. Now, in German, these are a little bit closer, right? We have Zweck, the end or the goal, or you can say purpose if you want, what it is that you're attempting to achieve, what it is that you're intending. And then purposiveness, Zweckmäßigkeit, how you tailor the action itself to attain that sort of end. When we talk about an action being purposive, we mean that there is some sort of point to it. That would be another way to translate Zweck, right? The point of the action. When Aristotle begins the Nicomachean Ethics by saying every choice, every mode of inquiry, every action, all these sorts of things, they all have a end, a telos. That's the same sort of idea. So we have the end, the goal, and then we have how we structure the action so as to attain that. What it is, you might say, that the end does to condition the action. So he says these can be distinguished. And then he says pure insight in relation to this action, whose action? The action of faith, adopts a negative attitude, right? He says, as in the other moments, it denies its own self. It must, as regards purposiveness, exhibit itself as lacking in intelligence. That's a strange thing for Hegel to say about insight, isn't it? Insight lacks in intelligence. Why would insight be lacking in intelligence? Well, it's not actually grasping what faith is doing. He says, it denies its own self, and it must, as regards purposiveness, exhibit itself as lacking intelligence. Why? Because insight, united with intention, Einsicht and Ansicht, right? What is that? The harmony of means and ends, which is what? Purposiveness and an end. Action is the means. The end is the purpose, or the point, right? It's denying to faith what it would accord to itself. He says, this harmony of ends and means appears to it as an other, or as the opposite of insight. Now, notice what else he says about this. As regards the end itself, it has to make badness, enjoyment, and possession its end. What is the end of the religious person? Badness, enjoyment, possession, its end, and so prove itself to be the impurest kind of intention, since pure intention qua other is equally impure intention. What are we talking about here? Again, the fundamental misunderstanding of what the believer is doing, the sincere believer, the genuine believer, not the person who's just trying to make a buck or the person who's completely superstitious. Insight is not able to understand this. Insight is not able to make sense in a human way of the human action that is somehow connecting the believer to what is believed in. Accordingly, we see that as regards purposiveness, enlightenment finds it foolish when the believer gives himself the superior consciousness of not being in bondage to natural enjoyment and pleasure by actually denying himself natural enjoyment and pleasure and demonstrating by his actions that his contempt for them is no lie but is genuine. Similarly, enlightenment finds it foolish that the individual absolves itself of its quality of being absolutely individual, excluding all others, and of possessing property of its own, by itself giving up its property. For thereby it shows in truth that it is not in earnest with this isolation of itself, but is raised above the natural necessity of isolating itself, and in this absolute isolation of being for self, denying that others are the same as itself. Pure insight finds both to be of no purpose as well as wrong. The purpose of showing oneself to be free of pleasure and possession is not served by denying oneself pleasure and giving away a possession. In the opposite case, therefore, it will declare the man a fool who, in order to eat, has recourse to actually eating. Insight also finds it wrong to deny oneself a meal and to give away butter and eggs, not for money, nor money for butter and eggs, but simply to give them away without receiving anything in return.
It declares a meal or the possession of things of that sort to be an end in itself, and hence in fact declares itself to be a very impure intention, which treats such enjoyment and possession as something wholly essential. Again, it also affirms as a pure intention the necessity of rising above natural existence, above acquisitiveness about the means of existence, only it finds it foolish and wrong that this elevation should be demonstrated by deeds. In other words, this pure insight is in truth a deception, which feigns and demands an inner elevation, but declares that it is superfluous, foolish, and even wrong to be in earnest about it, to put this elevation into actual practice and demonstrate its truth. Pure insight thus denies itself both as pure insight, for it denies directly purpose of action, and as pure intention, for it denies the intention of proving itself freed from the ends of a separate individual existence.
In paragraph 556, we find Hegel taking up the same line of criticism against insight and the Enlightenment, which is being turned against the religious believer, now deepening the examination of action. What is it that the action of the religious believer consists in? What is it trying to attain? What is its end, its Zweck? And why is the religious believer acting in the way that they do with the kind of purposiveness, Zweckmäßigkeit, tailoring the means of action, what they do, to the ends? So Hegel is going to tell us that as regards purposiveness, enlightenment is telling the believer that they're a fool. They're behaving foolishly, not by the end that they have, but by the means that they select, the purposiveness, the Zweckmäßigkeit of their action. What is he criticizing, the person of the Enlightenment? He's saying, you're giving things up that you shouldn't give up. Why shouldn't you give them up? Well, what are they, first of all? Hegel tells us they're going to be enjoyment, pleasure, and property. These are things of, if not necessarily the body, certainly of the world. And the religious believer is willing to sacrifice these, to say, these don't count as much, and I need to leave these behind so that I'm not in bondage to them. He says, the superior consciousness is that of not being in bondage to natural enjoyment and pleasure. So the person denies himself natural enjoyment and pleasure. Could be that of drink, could be that of food, could be that of sex, could be all sorts of things. What he does in this case is he demonstrates by his actions his contempt for them is no lie, but is genuine. He's not just putting on airs. He's not doing a show. He's not just following the rules. And you could say lots of religious people, do that sort of thing. They are just, bowing to social pressure. Hegel says, that's fine. I'm not talking about that kind of religious person. And the person of the Enlightenment, in taking every religious person to be of that sort, is doing them a disservice and misunderstanding them. And that's a problem. He says, similarly, enlightenment finds it foolish the individual absolves itself of its quality of being absolutely individual. What is this quality of being absolutely individual? It's property, it's possessions, it's Eigentum, that which it has for itself. He says it gives up its property. But what does it do when it gives up its property? Say, deeding something to a monastery or, sacrificing the wealth that it has or the opportunities for gaining wealth by ill-gotten ways, by following the rules, not charging exorbitant interest when they could. He says, by doing that, it shows in truth it's not in earnest with this isolation of itself, but raised above the natural necessity of isolating itself, and in this absolute isolation of being for self, denying that others are the same as itself. By giving up property, Hegel's saying, the person of faith is reasserting their connection with other people in absolute being. In the religious community, for example, giving alms, which may not be to somebody in the religious community, but incorporates them into a, you might say, brotherhood and sisterhood of human beings. So he goes on and he says, in doing this, it's raised above this natural necessity. Pure insight finds both of these things, sacrificing enjoyment or pleasure, sacrificing property, to be of no purpose. Of no purpose means not actually tailored to some end, and to be wrong, objectively wrong. What the hell are you doing? The person of the Enlightenment could say. How does this play itself out? He says, this purpose of showing yourself to be free, well, you don't have to give up anything for that. You don't have to make sacrifices. You already are free. What are you doing? Starving yourself, fasting, abstaining from drink, not having sex with anybody that you can, not, going after the big promotion, not, making a ton of money. What are you sacrificing this stuff for, he would say. So he'd say, the purpose of showing yourself to be free is not served by denial. In the opposite case, it says the man's a fool who, in order to eat, has recourse to actually eating. He says, insight finds it wrong to deny oneself a meal and to give away butter and eggs, not for money, nor money for butter and eggs, but simply to give them away without receiving anything in return. What are you getting from God when you put something into the collection plate? Is it really about the warm glow that you get? Well, then that's just your own satisfaction or pleasure, isn't it? Now we are getting on to something. He says, a meal or the possession of things are an end in itself. And so this insight is actually betraying the fact that it's actually got a rather impure intention. There's a play on words there, right? Insight is Einsicht and intention, Ansicht. So it's showing itself to be a little bit duplicitous. So he goes on and he says, again, it affirms as a pure intention the necessity of rising above natural existence. So the end, absolute being, freedom, human dignity. These are good ends. Where it's criticizing faith is in actually pursuing these ends in the ways that it does. So he says, we should, in fact, rise above natural existence. We should raise ourselves above acquisitiveness about the means of existence. Here's where it gets really funny. Only it finds it foolish and wrong this elevation should be demonstrated by deeds. In other words, he says, this pure insight is actually a deception, which feigns and demands an inner elevation, but then criticizes the people who actually do that and says it's not going to do that sort of thing. It's telling itself it's already attained it. Again, we want to think in terms like, what is Hegelian idealism really about? Is it enough just to have the idea of something and say, I've got the idea of freedom and that's good enough. I've got the idea of being this beautiful soul who rises above, filthy lucre and pleasure seeking or egoism or anything like that. No, you actually have to do something. You have to change who you are by making some sort of commitment. Maybe not necessarily the way the religious believer is, but certainly some sort of action, right? So he says it's deceptive, and he says it demands an inner elevation, but declares it superfluous, foolish, and even wrong to be in earnest about it. To put this elevation into actual practice and demonstrate its truth. Isn't that a wonderful way of talking about it there? If you want to say that you are actually above a bondage to pleasure, you have to demonstrate the truth of that. Demonstrating the truth doesn't mean like showing to some outside person that, you can refrain from screwing around or, whatever. Same thing with like the food. Well, you don't need to like it says in the gospel, right? When you fast, don't, put ashes on yourself. Actually, don't tell anybody you are fasting. Just don't eat a lot. That's what the religious believer is doing. They're not making a big show of it. Insight is the one who's all worked up about that sort of thing. So he goes on and he says, pure insight is arriving at a contradiction. It's denying itself both as pure insight, because it denies directly purposive action, and as pure intention, because it denies the intention of proving itself freed from the ends of a separate individual existence. This means that insight is arriving at a pretty bad point in its development. That's a problem. So how is it going to get out of that? And what is faith going to be able to maybe contribute to pure insight? Probably not a lot, because pure insight is still in this critical attitude towards faith.